out, started off as an educational charity, and it really was to support at that point teachers who kind of came out and were in danger of losing their jobs because we're going back 50 years through this period of time. And one of the teachers, John Warburton, attended a Pride, and he was teaching at a further education college. And one of his pupils said, "We saw you at Pride." And Pride at that point was not how Pride was just at this weekend. It was a rally. It was very much not like this. Wasn't actually in July. It was in a different time of the year. And he basically got called into the office the next day because it went around the school like wildfire because he didn't deny it. And the school then turned around and said to him that if he wanted his contract renewing, he would have to sign something to say he wasn't gay and he'd never disclose it to anybody in the school. He refused to do that and lost his job. And at that point, there was a group of teachers, lesbian and gay teachers at that time, who were part of the unions, the trade union movement, who then started petitions to try and get him his job back. And that was the kind of starting foundation of Schools Out. At that point, supported teachers. And there's been a very changed world since then in some ways, and not in others. So since then, they worked with educators and they worked to diversify the curriculum and try and support both teachers and pupils within schools, because they felt that if you can get supportive teachers, they had the biggest impact within the school environment to help support people who are LGBT plus. And they taught before Section 28, which most people I hope have heard of, but I'll talk a little bit if you haven't. Section 28 was a rule that came in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher that prohibited local authorities talking about LGBT lives as pretend families. So you couldn't promote it as a pretend family. You couldn't promote it within, and promote wasn't really a legal term. So it didn't have a definition of what promote would be. Would promote be a book? Would promote be something talking about LGBT plus people? And although it actually didn't apply to most schools, because most schools were separate from the local authority at that point, and it only actually applied to local authorities, most schools thought it applied to them. So if you had a library that was run by a local authority, it definitely applied to libraries, so they couldn't promote LGBT books and many other things. But in the education sector, even though Schools Out campaigned with the unions to say, look, you can still support people, you can continue to do this work, it meant for a whole generation of people, you couldn't tackle bullying in schools for LGBT plus people. You couldn't talk about it. You couldn't talk about it in sex education. So I went through my entire schooling without anybody talking in a positive light about LGBT plus people, any way, shape or form. And that was for generations of people who had a whole period of time where we might be learning in school about somebody who might be an author who was actually part of the LGBT plus community, but they couldn't say that. So you would not be able to look at that. So you might actually look at something from Oscar Wilde, but you would never know. You would never be able to look into that. You might be looking, I remember looking at war poetry, and it was clearly talking about two men, but you clearly couldn't actually discuss that theme of the poetry. You could do everything else, but not just that. So after Section 28, it took a long time for it to be repealed. It eventually was repealed, and that meant different times across England, Wales and Scotland and Ireland. But once it was repealed, it meant schools could actually start talking about LGBT plus people. So Schools Out founded LGBT plus History Month. Has anybody heard about LGBT plus History Month? Oh, a couple of people. I'm glad there's a couple of people. So it's been going now over 20 years. And it was launched in 2004 at the Tate Modern concept. And that was because Section 28 had been repealed. And we wanted a dedicated space in which schools could talk about LGBT plus people. We call it usualize and visibilize. So could actually visibilize LGBT plus people and could usualize LGBT plus people instead of just talking about normal. So if you think every time you use the word normal, we would use the word usual. And it was supposed to be a dedicated space in which we could talk about the LGBT plus history, which had been hidden and actually was in the curriculum in some ways because you'd learn about Shakespeare, you'd learn about other people, but you wouldn't actually know that they were part of the LGBT plus community, and we wouldn't know our own history. So that's why LGBT History Month was founded, and it was founded for February because that was the short, in school terms, that's like the best month because it didn't have exams, it was the shortest term, it had a half term, which meant museums and libraries who hadn't been able to talk about LGBT plus books or talk about in their exhibitions at work from LGBT plus people could do that. And in the half term, that meant families could go and actually find out more about it. So that was particularly why February was chosen. And at one point, it was going to be repealed in the February. So we've been going now for many, many years. And this is an opportunity now where we didn't expect businesses to take part, but businesses do as well. And it happens every February. There's a different theme, and it's a different chance to really highlight LGBT plus people. So we pick 5 people throughout history. It's always been trans inclusive from the very beginning. We launched at the Tate Modern when it's just been built. There were 13 people on stage and probably about 26 people in the audience at that point. We had a very, very inclusive group. We wanted to make sure that we had people from different ethnicities. We wanted to have people with disabilities. We wanted to show the breadth of the LGBT plus community. And we also had some straight allies as well to show that the power of supporting each other. And that was in November. We always launched this kind of in November. And then in the February, we went to First History Month, and we were hoping that we might have maybe 40 events. We had something like over 250 events. And since then, it's grown and grown and grown. We basically provide tools and information for people to be able to celebrate from and do that in their own way. We now have a theme each year. So the theme for this year has been science and innovation. We highlight 5 historical figures and provide free resources for schools and beyond so that they can be used so we can learn our history. We also involve schools to design the badge and to take part in a poetry competition so that there's a different ways to get involved with it. And they're all
range of
a whole range of work, which it's all run by volunteers. And we do speak at a lot of education conferences as well, and work with, and we founded an international group of LGBT History Months. So there are something like 20 LGBT History Months, and they're celebrated in each country with something that's meaningful for that country. So it does vary across the world. We helped set up quite a few in kind of the Nordic countries. And then the very first LGBT History Month that ever was founded was in America by Rodney, who was also a teacher from Missouri. And that was founded, and we were the second LGBT History Month to be founded. And because of when the events happened in the UK, we have Black History Month in October in the UK, and we have LGBT plus History Month in February. In the US, it happens to be completely the reverse. So it's just happened to be from where we work through. Internationally, there's been a lot of pushback because we've had to work with organisations in Hungary, and because they've brought in Section 28. So this Section 28, which was repealed and was so destructive in the UK, destructive for people, we've exported it to some extent. And now you've got other countries in Europe that are starting to do that in differing degrees. So sometimes it means Heartstopper, for example, couldn't be shown in various countries because of this, because it was seen as the propaganda using exactly the same terms. We can become complacent when we have the legislative change and think that's how it's always going to be, and not realise that those rights can be challenged. And what we're seeing a lot, especially in America and in Europe, you're definitely seeing certain pockets of that directly being in. So the whole landscape in Russia has completely changed for LGBT people. It's changed in various other places, like in Poland. So there's been really challenges that way, but closer to home, we're facing really big challenges here, especially for the trans and non-binary communities. So there have been many different kind of rules that have been brought in, and some that hit in September. So in September, there are some new sex education guidance, which has got some really positive things that have really included a lot of extra things which would be really supportive for multiple people, including the LGBT plus community. But there are other elements that are quite regressive for the community within there. Similarly, because there was a piece of legislation that was called gender questioning children, they couldn't even use the word trans within it, that went out to consultation. That has that isn't going through at the moment, but they've turned it into another piece of legislation which is just going through, and we're waiting to see how that's going to hit schools and what that means.
It's a constant kind of getting and fending off, and
but even more so since the Cass report, even more so since the Cass report, and even more so since the court hearings that we've had, court cases that we've had around transgender rights. And it doesn't just impact the transgender and non-binary people, it also impacts the lesbian, gay, bisexual people as well. So you've got all of these things coming in education, which means organisations that have been inclusive and have started that work. And what you've got to think is you only just had the first generation through the entire school system that hasn't lived under the shadow of Section 28. And it's almost like we're now going back into that. It's not exactly the same, but it looks like we're going back into that same cycle, which means rates of, and coupled with that, you've also got new rules that are coming out about 16-year-olds and usage of social media. So the social media will be banned. That's going through Parliament at the moment. That has a real impact on the LGBT plus community, because if you're not in a safe, secure environment at home, where are you going to look for information? You're going to look on the internet. And if you are barred from actually looking at lots of sites, you're not going to necessarily be able to find your way to get the information you need. So you're kind of further isolated again. So we're going into a really tricky period that means that the rights we've had are changing. There are lots of great schools doing great work and wanting to support the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender pupils within the school and their staff. But there are schools that are more hesitant about it. And what happens when you have all these changes come in? Schools that were thinking of becoming more supportive will step back from that position. It also puts teachers into a really difficult position to know what they can say, what they can't say. And it means that for a generation of young people, we're starting to bring that element of shame back in.
Yeah.
And that one of the things I really resonated with was when we look at especially from the place of night, when you look at there's a whole generation of people that live with shame before they can fully accept themselves and come out. And we started to get the next generation where that wasn't a thing in the same way. And you look at the reaction to Heartstopper from the younger generation, and then from people who went through education system where you couldn't hold your hand of your same-sex partner within your school system. That would have just been, you just couldn't. And now, so I think for a lot of people that was like a grieving process of what we could have had. And it's just worrying that we're potentially facing that same dilemma coming through.
And that the advances, I don't know if you've got anything to add, but the advances of social media, as we were saying earlier, can seem like we're opening things up, but they can also bring, well, in our last Q&A, the discussion was that they can also bring more dissection and focus on people who are being targeted. So there's always that kind of, never a simple solution. There's always kind of two sides to look at.
And I think if I was a young person, bullying is awful. But if you had bullying when you're at school, you could at least get away from it, potentially when you got home. Whereas now bullying is in the phone that you carry with you. And that's with you every second of the day.
Yeah.
And that is a real challenge. So I understand why they're looking at a social media ban, and I get the reasons why from one side of the coin. But from the other side of the coin, you've got to still make sure that the services and help and advice are still available for young people. Otherwise, you're cutting them off.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're going to say something, and I
was going to say, looks at bullying. Obviously, it's within her dream, so a lot of it is about the sort of internalization of the bullying and the kind of how it turns into shame, and also this really strange kind of thing. At least what I experienced when I came out was this strange sort of fascination with same-sex desire, where suddenly you have people almost like wanting to know if you desire them in order to then turn it on you and make it something they can be mean to you about. And I think it's really, there's this fascination with same-sex desire. There really is, because people don't understand it, partially because of education, and it's still seen as a kind of not usual thing. It's, you know, and there's a fascination with it, and it makes people into zoo animals. And that's something that I think that's what we wanted to look at with the scene, is that kind of feeling of, you know, being watched all the time, or like just having this presence and not feeling like you can just be in your own skin. Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognise that there are still young LGBT plus people who, when they do come out or they're found out or they're outed, cannot go home. And you would think that that doesn't still exist now. But the youth homelessness population, it's about 25% of that population of young people who are homeless are LGBT plus, which is disproportionate for the number of LGBT plus people. And you would think at this point that that wasn't needed, that wasn't the case, because there is more visibility. But that, if you look at AKT, and we were just chatting earlier, so I work in housing and education.
The Albert Kennedy Trust.
Yeah, Albert Kennedy Trust and others, and some of the research work that they've done through, there is that real thing of just the reality that it might not be safe for LGBTQ young people to be out. And that whole thing at school of kind of that people wanting to know and that getting back to families is not always, it's still in some cases not always safe for young people to come out.
I think
But I think that's forgotten.
And I was trying to articulate, I didn't articulate it very well at all just now, but it's that sense of some things are very rooted in these very old-fashioned repressive ways, while we seem to also have all this technology and complexity of information at our fingertips, and you just can't ever assume that one is winning out over the other, can you? That's, and so many basic rights for children and young people at school, as you've said, just have never consistently been there, or just been there for a fraction of time. Maybe we can bring in some questions if anyone has any questions at this point. Yes, please.
It's kind of a question. It's also a bit. What I thought was really beautiful about tonight is, yeah, there were a lot of triggering moments that took me back to when I was a young gay guy at school, and, you know, white gay guy, northern working class, all that kind of, it's a different story. The things that we're talking about here, social media, where it's going now, yes, they're all relevant to tonight, because of what you did is you took a very elemental story and you took us into a dream state as well, and it became about that moment where you had the dual scene where she was being picked on in the changing room, and then the second scene was so powerful because that was the turning point of her going, no, actually. And it wasn't even as simple as she just stood up to it. There was the walking on the floor. It was almost like kind of Killing Eve kind of, like, just really like, what's going on in her head? How is she working this through? And fortunately, we had this beautiful story where she came out of the dream at the end and was just like, well, you can accept me parents or not. And happily they did, kind of, it seemed, sort of thing. But what I loved about tonight was just that you were telling this story that you could relate to the 80s, the 90s, the Section 28, all of those things. You could set it into the future, but it was ultimately about a human being going, I've had all this shame or whatever's going on in my head, and through this one experience, through the going into the woods, the Midsummer Night's Dream, whatever the things you were doing became this transformative experience. And to me, that's what makes this exciting. Everything that you're talking about, kind of going, yes, that's the thing in the news, that's how we talk about things. What makes this really exciting as theatre is you can apply all that, and it's really meaningful even now, and it would have been meaningful 20 years ago, would be meaningful in 10 years. There's just something going on that we can all read in different ways. So it's not really a question, because I just absolutely loved everything that it was doing. It was really exciting, dream state. It's like, and it was what I love as well is when you get things from, you know, we talk about gay culture, and we might talk about Jean Genet or Sarah Waters and stuff like that. So you kind of we've got a definite world. But the things that were pinging off in my head was like the film The Cell or Killing Eve, or things like, it was just pinging lots of things, like, we're a part of culture. We're in those stories, and we tell stories, and we live those stories. And the stories aren't just about, I'm coming out and it's really difficult, or I've, you know, the HIV story, or, you know, the kind of the standard ones. It wasn't doing that, and also it wasn't the standard gay couple as well. It was a lesbian couple, and also they weren't established. They were really young as well, and one of them was a bit of a bully as well. So it was just, it had so much richness.
I think that's the
Thank you so
story.
much for saying
So
that.
not really a question, sorry. I
Because it
just,
was
you know.
deliberately written, obviously deliberately written to not be a specific moment,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
also
yeah.
be now.
Is delayed for so many people because it's not safe for them to be
Mhm.
in that environment. So if they go off to university or they go off to move to another town, or and it's what is we're entering a stage where those relationships are happening at a younger age. And they probably always were happening at that age, were just hidden. Well hidden. But actually more open than they were before. But I think the one thing is the power of storytelling, and that's the one reason for History Month, is it's the stories, it's our history, it's where we've come from. Because we connect as people to other people. So we connect to people's stories. And you can say whatever statistics, and they have their power and they have their place. But if you actually sit and have a conversation with someone, there's usually a lot more understanding that actually comes from that. And for some people, it's a journey. I quite like to also know when you talked about, there was one section where you were like, almost like she hates the streets in there because of, and then like, why? Because there's
a moment.
yeah, she has a moment where she goes, I've captured all of this, I've captured that. And I think that it's that that recognition that, and it took me years to understand the term heteronormative world, but that's a bit too fancy for me. But realistically, it's that whole thing about we're programmed in a certain way and everything's geared up for that certain way. And so you find your own path despite of that almost.
She's
And-
putting a
yeah.
glimmer of that there, but part
That's
of it,
really interesting.
Lady Nightshade is also reminding her that you do care about your parents as well.
Yeah.
It's this tug of war, isn't it?
And I think also for parents, it's that whole journey of they had an idea of what their child life is going to be like, and they're needing that time to adjust to the oh, that's that person. That could be on anything. That could be you wanted your child to be a doctor, or it could be, but it's that kind of adjustment period of I thought these things. And I definitely know from my own parents' side, there was very much oh well, you won't, the assumptions of you'll have a really difficult life.
Yeah, that's
Why do you always have to make things the hardest for you?
Yeah.
I remember that would be quite a, and they are like, they're totally supportive now, they're on like on Pro Match and everything else, but it does take a journey. And I think and it depends which culture. I come from up north as well, and my dad was more pretty understanding, probably because we had similar taste in women and our eyes would wander.
connecting.
Well, I think he knew a lot long before I said anything on the subject. So
That's it, there's so much nuance.
yeah, there is
are the
nuance.
classic versions of what might happen, but also within that, there's so much human detail.
Yeah.
In each family.
And there's different. You also have to remember different cultures and different places. Some of them's really religious, so there was a kind of element of her kind of navigating that journey through. And
Which
so
we tried to sort of suggest possibly in this,
I
but
did wonder.
without going into too much
It
detail.
reminded me very much of the Jeanette Winterson Orange.
Orange
There
is
was
the
one bit in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, and that was quite important because I think that's one of the first things I'd seen when I was doing it.
Phenomenal.
So it had that kind of nod to those things. But I think arts and plays and culture have always been a part of this. Part of the campaign against Section 28 was the arts and culture movement. And that really did kind of go towards that. And as people, we've worked in these creative spaces to try and get the messages across. And it's how to tell a story in a way that resonates. But as you say, it would resonate now as it would resonate later. And because there's always still that navigation piece that you do as an individual.
There's theatre about young people, and a lot of it is like phones and screens going and faces being lit up and people going and it's like, actually, is that representative of a young person's experience right now? And actually putting her in a world that is very earthy and very natural is an interesting opposition to that, because then you really get to dig deep into like under the surface of the phones and the social media and everything, what is going on inside that girl's head. And sometimes I think the phone conversation kind of stops there, and it's like, actually underneath that, what are young people experiencing if everyone's phones disappeared today? Like exactly what are they experiencing and what help do they need? Because I think it goes much deeper than that, and I think that's what we've been able to do by resisting the tropes of theatre about young people.
So I know we've got limited time, so are there any other questions coming up? If not, we will keep nattering, as you can see. We go on. But was there any kind of burning question or observation. Don't be shy. What were you going to say?
Just on that that connection, there's still that point where everybody remembers the first person they had a crush on, or the first person they fancied, and that whole experience is pretty universal. You do remember that first person you loved, whether it be good or bad. You still remember that first experience, and that's part of growing up and growing through life. And that, I think, was really mirrored in here. And that was, and at the heart of it, it is that experience of you're still navigating those challenges
While having
the
opinions
barriers
or
and
kind of fixed ideas about who you are thrown on you when it's all still very tentative.
Yeah.
That was important to kind of have all that uncertainty, but also not make it too uncertain. So that's been very much the journey we've been on, hasn't it? To make this story and production specific, but also have lots of ambiguity in it.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about it sitting in this really interesting place in Marin's life where she knows she doesn't want to be what her parents want her to be. She knows that for a fact, but she doesn't quite know what the alternative is yet. Like exactly, and she knows she's gay, so we know that. But in terms of how she wants to relate to her parents, how she wants to relate to her peers at school, what her values are, like like how do I define myself if it's not by what my parents had in mind for me? Because you're kind of like, okay, the cookie cutter's gone, so now I'm just kind of like a big squashy flat cookie, and I don't know how to
All these desires.
with all these desires and shame and so it's interesting to sit in this really like ambiguous and uncomfortable place, and we wanted that with the end scene as well, with the parents, that we don't know what dark night of the soul they've had and they're sitting in this uncomfortable place where they know they want their daughter in their life, but they don't quite know how to have a gay daughter yet.
Yeah.
And I think that is quite honest and quite real with a lot of parents at the moment, in terms of not knowing what the right thing to do is or the right thing to say, just knowing they don't want to lose their daughter completely. But just sitting in that uncomfortable place is a really interesting thing to do with theatre, because you get to do it communally with other people. It's like, okay, if we all sit in this really uncomfortable, ambiguous place, maybe we can figure it out a little bit. I don't know.
And I think that representation of just that journey aspect of it, and that really, what is this new world we're navigating? Where do we go with it?
Yeah.
What does it mean? Everybody's navigating something in their own right within that, and I think that's very representative of the journey through.
Yeah, things don't always resolve themselves with satisfaction. That's more real.
But they can over time.
They can over time, but it's interesting to try and approach something that feels real like that in a surreal.
Yeah, I definitely think you have different reactions from different people, and it's that whole kind of journey through. But what was really nice is that it was young people. It was really representative of young people at that cusp, kind of experiencing that. Whereas I think we've had quite a few stories of kind of coming out later and what that means and where that goes from. It was quite interesting to just see that actually from a young person's perspective.
And thank you so much for coming. Tell other people to come. We're here till Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.